Hello and welcome to the She Reads Romance Books podcast, the ultimate show for romance book lovers looking for the best books worth reading. I'm your host, Leslie Murphy, and in each short episode, I share my favorite book list of recommendations so you know exactly what to add to your must-read list. Join me as I explore the romance genre and have fun collecting book boyfriends along the way, because life is better with a love story. Hey readers, thanks for joining me today here on the She Reads Romance Books podcast. I tell you, this month is flying by, but I feel like I'm saying that every month this year. And I probably start these podcast episodes the same way, saying, this month flew by, but I'm serious that I'm glad it is now because I am super excited for the warm weather to finally come and stay. But we are actually about to head out on spring break, which I am so ready for. I've just about got our bags packed and my Kindle is full. So really, that's all that matters. I don't care for bathing suit, sunglasses, full Kindle. I think that makes for a really good spring break. But I'm hoping to crank through quite a few books. We really don't have a lot planned for this vacation. Just some time at the pool and maybe the beach, and I'm totally fine with that. I've been working quite a bit and putting a few finishing touches on the She Reads Romance Books book club, which if you haven't heard is launching very soon, like soon. So please join my email list so you can be the first to know when I get the sign up posted, so you can join the membership and find out what our first book is going to be. I've already lined up the author to join us for a Q&A session, and it's going to be so amazing because she's awesome and I love her, and it's going to be a lot of fun. But onto my reading list. This was, I have to say, an interesting month of reading for me. I had a few favorite books of the month, I'll say, several contemporary romances. But then the other two were a werewolf romance and a historical romance. Those categories kind of seem like total opposites of the spectrum, kind of. And yet, a love story is a love story, right? Whether it's set back in old England or in a world with werewolves or even a shadow beast. But unfortunately, it was also a month where several books just didn't hit the mark for me. Either because the writing didn't flow or the story just didn't do it for me. And there were several books like this in a row, which was really a bummer and got me in a bit of a reading slump. And I think there was even one or two books I just didn't even finish at all. They just went on the do not finish pile. I embrace the do not finish pile. I don't like when it happens, but if a book isn't clicking with me, I have no problems now putting it on that shelf. But when I'm in a reading rut like I was this month and have several books that I just don't click with, I start to get really uncomfortable about reviewing books and sharing my thoughts on them because I am not an author, right? And I think it's pretty darn hard to be a great author. But that doesn't mean, I think, that my expectations aren't high for those who choose to write a book. I don't want to blast anybody for their work, but I do want to be honest in what I think about something. And even just saying that, the America Ferrera monologue from the Barbie movie comes to mind when I feel this way, because I feel like you should be honest, but not too honest, right? And you can't be too critical or you're considered a bitch, right? So my point being that I hope in talking about books that I suggest you skip, right? And I don't care for, that the intent comes across that I'm really just sharing my point of view of what worked or what didn't work for me from the story. But that doesn't take away from the author's hard work and that, someone else could absolutely love the book. And it kind of also makes me think about people who review restaurants, right? Now, those people, I assume, are not chefs, right? Just like I'm not an author, but they're there to review a restaurant and the dishes they try and to give their opinion on how the chef mixes flavors, how they present all the different pieces to a full meal. And sometimes those pieces just don't come together well, right? And I'd rather have a restaurant reviewer tell me that, honestly, instead of writing a review that they liked everything, because that's not always the case, right? Anyway, I think I'm just rambling now, but given those thoughts, I'm just going to quickly talk about the books that didn't work for me this month, and then I'll kind of follow it up with the books that really were hits for me. So the first book that I read was Euro Dreams by Kate Stewart. This is a contemporary romance about two colleagues on I'd say, quasi work trip to Europe. Lucian is this amazing surgeon who's about to do a groundbreaking surgery, and the heroine is a nurse who's along for the trip to assist in that surgery. It's sort of marketed as like a trip from hell, enemies to lovers romance, but it didn't really come across that way to me. I honestly don't think I've ever stopped reading a Kate Stewart book before because she's one of my favorite authors, but I was really baffled by this one because I just didn't understand what I was reading, what the point of the story was. I stopped about almost 50% into the book. Yes, the heroine's start to their trip was full of a few crazy moments, but nothing I thought that was super outrageous, right? And then the two of them just kept having the same conversation about a deal to be real with each other, but then it gets kind of wordy, and I didn't really know what they were trying to get out of those conversations, and I just honestly didn't really click with either main character. So basically, I was just confused by the plot, wasn't hooked by the characters, and so I ended up just stop reading it. But again, Euro Dreams might be a good fit for you. It just unfortunately wasn't for me this month. The next book that I stopped reading almost halfway through as well was At First Spite by Olivia Dade, which was another enemies to lovers romance. And I love this trope, right? Which is partly why I picked this book. But I was sad, to kind of call it quits on almost 50% of this book, especially because it was also my pick for the March Romance Book Reading Challenge, in which the prompt was to read one contemporary romance. Though I guess I did read other books that fit this challenge for that this month. But this is about Athena, who ends up moving into this tiny house called the Spite House, which she had initially bought as a pre-wedding gift for her fiance. But then her fiance goes and ends their engagement, and she has already quit her job thinking that she's going to be getting married and moving in with her, ex-fiance. So she kind of has no choice but to move into the house herself and look for a new job. But part of being owner of this house is that she now is neighbors with her almost brother-in-law neighbor, Dr. Matthew Vine, who she pretty much hates, hence the enemies to lovers story, because she thinks he's the one that convinced his younger brother to call off the engagement. I thought this, honestly, given the book summary, would be a mix of funny and sweet because she conspires to make Matthew's life pretty miserable. Yet he actually really does like Athena and he tries to help her out, but the story just wasn't moving forward for me. I think others might like it, but I have a feeling that I don't think Olivia Dade's books are for me. I've tried and stopped another one of her titles a couple months ago. So maybe it's just her storytelling that isn't for me, despite, I think, loving the setups that she comes up with for her stories. That's what sort of grips me. But this one just didn't quite hit the mark. Now, the next book I did finish, but I didn't love it. Fake-ish is the first book I've read by Winter Renshaw, and the story, I have to say, was intriguing, but for, I don't know, lack of a better description, it kind of read like a debut novel to me. It's a unique fake relationship romance, if you love those. Briar and Dorian meet up at a friend's sort of joint bachelor and bachelorette party and end up spending the night together just talking mostly, but then having this epic one-night stand. And then after that night, they kind of make this pact to reconnect in 2 years after Dorian's done touring with the bands that he manages. But they're not going to talk to each other at all in those 2 years apart. So that part at the beginning, it was great, and it was a good hook to the story. But then they end up face to face with each other just a year later when Briar agrees to pose as her boss's fiance so that he can gain his inheritance. All she has to do is spend the summer on his family's island. But there she comes face to face again with Dorian, who happens to be Burke, her pretend fiance and boss's brother. So a lot kind of going on there. And I picked it up because I liked that fake relationship that sort of implodes in her face. But the characters were just a bit off for me. The family drama with Burke and his siblings felt kind of contrived and not really fleshed out. And I didn't believe that Dorian would ask her to wait for him, given just how he was characterized at the beginning. It just didn't fit who he came across as. So I felt like this one had the bones of a really good story, but it just didn't execute it to my liking, I'll say. Okay, so moving on from some of the disappointments of the month, I next read one of my most anticipated new romance books for 2024, which was A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams. This came out in February and has a focus on leap years, which was very fitting since this year was a leap year. And without spoiling it, there is this sort of magical, I'll say, thread that brings the hero and the heroine together in New York City. Now, Ricky Wilde is the heroine, and she is from this powerful Atlanta dynasty family, if you will, where her father owns this chain of funeral homes, of all things, and her sisters, two sisters, have all bought franchises and work for the business too. So it's pretty much expected that Ricky will join the family business, but she's never really, felt that she fits in with everybody. Instead, she has this love of flowers, and so she finally just decides to up and move to New York City to open her own flower shop. And she kind of gets the motivation to do so after meeting this 90-year-old widow, Miss Della, who invites her to rent the bottom floor of her Harlem brownstone. Because this was one of my most anticipated books of the year, and because I loved Williams' book 7 Days in June, I totally admit that my expectations for this one were super high. And I'll say that overall, I enjoyed it. I'm really glad that I read it. But it's one of those books that after finishing it, all I can really think about is what could have made it better. I think this book didn't quite capture me to the same extent as 7 Days in June did, because it was trying to be so many things in one, and yet trying to be so many things, none of those things were fully flushed out in the way that I felt like they could have or should have, and that would have made it like an outstanding book. For example, I found this to be a historical book, right? Talking about the Harlem Renaissance. And honestly, this was the part that I loved most about the book. While I'd say the initial chapters delved into the Harlem Renaissance, I found it fascinating and such a really great hook. That piece kind of faded as the story went on, to where then just facts and names from that time period were kind of just thrown out as the book went on, and it just sort of felt disjointed. I honestly would have loved if this was just a historical romance set in the Harlem Renaissance time period, so she could really flesh out everything of that time, since I thought it was like really captivating and I just wanted to learn more. But the book also seemed to kind of be a coming of age story, for lack of a better description, for Ricky, at least from the beginning, talking about her unsupportive family and her nasty sisters. And yet the family just sort of dropped off to the wayside too as the book goes on. And even her quest to start up her flower shop sort of got some momentum, but then kind of fell off to the background. Like, I don't really understand how she got it started, how she maintained business. It just sort of, again, meandered off into the story. I, of course, picked it up for the romance, but the romance piece almost seems kind of tacked on to this historical romance or historical book I felt it was developing and this coming of age story. Ricky and Ezra run into each other maybe 2 times, and it was then complete insta-love. And I typically don't mind insta-love in some books. However, I really didn't understand how they became so consumed with each other in such a short time, which kind of made their, sex scenes a little cringy to me as well. I did love the aspect of her friendship with her, like, sort of adoptive grandmother that Miss Della became, and the friendship with her new friend Tuesday. But again, those were sort of thrown in, rushed, and could have had a little bit more development. But all of this is to say that there was a lot sort of going on in the book. Some parts were really interesting and good, but reflecting back on the story as a whole, I just felt like it was just jointed or just not developed enough. I feel like she could have written a whole nother book to flesh this out, and then it would have been amazing. As I said, the Harlem Renaissance part was honestly the best. And the magical aspect, it became apparent. It was pretty obvious how it was going to end, so that wasn't much of a surprise. So I would say, if you want to read about that time period, if you're a fan of Tia Williams, then definitely read it. I just went in hoping to really love it, but found it just sort of good and wanting a bit more. Okay, I feel like I have beat that dead horse enough. On to my werewolf romance phase of the month. The first book being Wolf Gone Wild by Juliet Cross, which is the first book in her Stay a Spell series, which I can't believe I haven't really picked up before now. I think it's now already a full completed series. This book focuses on Mateo Cruz, the hero, who is a werewolf who has been unable to shift for the past 3 months. And because he hasn't been able to shift, he hears his wolf in his head, who is pushing him to take up his more carnal and violent urges. And he's pretty much making Mateo go insane. So he seeks out the help of Evie, who is a witch whose power is to break curses. Now, even though there is this unspoken, or maybe it was spoken, I can't remember, but spoken or unspoken rule that she and her witch sisters don't mix with werewolves, Evie decides to help Mateo, but soon realizes that it's not just some simple curse that is affecting him. And while she and her sisters try to figure out how to help him, she agrees to hang out with Mateo for at least 4 hours a day so that he can complete the art commissions that he has lined up for work, because he is a sculptor and he hasn't been able to get any work done with his wolf constantly in his head. But it seems that his wolf definitely quiets down whenever he is around Evie. Obviously, because both he and the wolf really like her, and her wolf basically declares that Evie is their mate. So I really enjoyed this one. I gave it, I can't remember, maybe 3 or 4 stars. I liked the fact that Mateo heard his wolf in his head, as it was a really good juxtaposition of Mateo in his human form, who was this sweet guy who didn't want his urges to overtake him. And then there was Alpha, who was all about violence to anyone who threatens them or Evie, and who wanted to fuck her any chance she was around, basically. So poor Mateo was just trying to balance it all and not scare Evie away. The beginning was a tad slow, if anything, but I liked the chemistry between the characters, and Cross does a really great job of introducing you to Evie's sisters and other characters whose books you get, I think, further along into this series. So I recommend this one if you like werewolf romances or even witch romances. The next werewolf romance I read was Rejected by Jamin Eve, if that's how you pronounce her name. And honestly, it was one I just happened to randomly pick up on Kindle Unlimited, and I'm kind of glad I did. It's book 1 in her Shadow Beast Shifter series. So this is about Mara, the heroine. She is part of a pact that hates her and bullies her. She is almost 18. No, is that right? I think she's 18, or was it early 20s? I can't remember. But she's bullied because her father had challenged the alpha of the pack and lost, and he was killed. So she's been paying for his choices ever since and just biding her time until she has her first shift and can just leave the pack. And when she does end up having her first shift, it turns out that her true mate is the son of the alpha, but he rejects her. And with that denial, her inner wolf howls and ends up touching the shadow world and bringing the shadow beast, who is their shifter god, to her. And then the shadow beast basically kidnaps her and takes her to his lair, for lack of a better word. So hope you could follow all of that of the story. This book really did start out kind of like a bully romance in her hometown, turned sort of enemies to lovers romance with the shadow beast, which has both paranormal and fantasy elements with a strong heroine to the story. And since it's book 1 in the series, it does end on a cliffhanger, so FYI to that. But after reading this, honestly, my first thought was this book has so many similarities to A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas, only kind of with a more paranormal angle along to it, along with the fantasy elements, as I said. And the more I thought about it, the more and more similarities I saw. So first, you have this strong heroine who doesn't have a great home life. She does something, and in this case, she howls and touches the Shadowlands, which prompts her to be taken against her will by a leader, in her case, the Shadow Beast, which is exactly sort of kind of what happens in A Court of Thorns and Roses, right? The Shadow Beast needs her for a particular reason, which he isn't upfront about at first, just as Tamlin needs Feyre and doesn't tell her why. And then you have the heroine who is sort of bullied, or at least not treated well at the beginning, right? And becomes so much more powerful than anybody realizes by the end. And she ends up falling for the person she shouldn't, who even took her in the first place. So again, a ton of A Court of Thorns and Roses similarities in my mind. And I think there's even more, but I won't go into to saying those for risk of spoiling anything. But it's really kind of uncanny if you think about it. And I would say another similarity, at least for me, is that I found both books to be a little bit slow in parts, which, you know, if they were just sort of edited a little bit tighter, they would have both been outstanding. But I really did enjoy this. Definitely want to move on to the next book in the series. So I would definitely read it if you like werewolves, fated mates, strong heroines, or just paranormal romance in general. The next book for my March reading list, I listened to as an audiobook, and OMG, I freaking loved this book. Now, I mentioned that I loved a historical romance at the beginning of this episode, and this is it. I finally sat down with How to Tame a Wild Rogue by Julie Ann Long. And man, I tell you, this book just reinforces how much I love her work and how talented a writer she is. Plus, I normally don't listen to audiobooks, and I probably say this all the time, but this one was phenomenal. It was narrated by Justine Iyer, and I cannot say enough of how fantastic her voices are. They are just fantastic, and her delivery was just perfection. So, loved this audiobook. This is book 6 in Long's Palace of Rogues series, which features love stories set within the famed hotel, the Grand Palace on the Thames. I read book 3, which is called, what's it called? When I Was Wicked, or I'm Only Wicked with You. One of those. When I'm Only Wicked with You, I think, prior to this one. But I definitely believe it can be read as a standalone. Though you should know the couples from book 1 and 2 are featured pretty heavily in this book. So if you don't want their sort of love stories or unions to be spoiled, you may want to just start at the beginning of the series. But honestly, you can't go wrong whether you start at the beginning or just with this book. But this story is about Daphne, our heroine. She is found one dark night dangling out of a second-story window, trying to escape in an unsavory working situation when she is, luckily rescued by Lorcan St. Ledger. And because of the late hour and with a raging storm on their heels, the two find themselves at the door of the Grand Palace on the Thames in desperate need of shelter from this storm. But, of course, the only room available is a suite, so the two have to pose as a married couple before knowing that people from their respective paths are either owners of the club or the owner's spouses. Now, if you love a good, slow burn, opposites attract romance, then this is the book for you. There is just so much I loved about it. The first being the characters. Honestly, I'm a sucker for a strong heroine, especially when it comes to historical romance, and Daphne is amazing. She's a woman she's had to step up in life, right? Since the early age of 11, she then got jilted by a former fiance, and now she's faced with a proposal from a much older man with a title, though, that she pretty much has to take given her father's debts. Then you have our hero, Lorcan, a man who came up from nothing, did not always do it in a lawful way, but he now owns a ship and is a privateer. He, though, immediately comes to Daphne's rescue and plays the dutiful part as her loving husband, and ultimately becomes the one person that she can let go with and truly depend on. And let me just say that I love reading Julianne Long's books because her writing is just exquisite in her prose, in her word choice. I mean, every sentence seems like a masterpiece, but it doesn't come across as like heady or too wordy, right? If that makes sense. Her writing, honestly, it's just beautiful in her descriptions and how she builds up the tension and the chemistry between her characters. And I have to say, especially in this book, she's also amazing because she can write the steamiest scenes when all Daphne has to do is put her hand on Lorcan's thigh and the tension freaking skyrockets to 100%. And then there's this scene where the two of them are playing a game and Lorcan gets her so worked up just by her words. And then he wins this bet to kiss her on her upper thigh. And oh my God, I felt like it was honestly the steamiest scene ever. And all he did was just kiss her thigh. I mean, it was amazing. And just again, an example of how amazing I think her writing is because, you didn't need a lot of graphic sex or anything. I think you do get it in a few parts, but like it was just like intense, the chemistry, intention that she built up between these two characters. Plus, I have to say, oh my gosh, this book had the best proposal speech I think that I've ever read in a book. Lorcan, gosh, I love the man, such a good book boyfriend. And this is a great book that I cannot recommend enough. So check out How to Tame a Wild Rogue by Julianne Long. Okay, gosh, did I talk that book up enough? I hope I did because it was totally worth it. But the next book I read this month was Lynn Painter's newest release, Happily Never After. The setup of this romance and the meet cute for the hero and heroine is what totally drew me to the story. Plus the fact that I fell pretty hard for Lynn's writing last year after reading The Love Wager. So I wanted to make sure that I loved more of her books or maybe see if she was a one-hit wonder for me. And this book, too, was also one of my most anticipated romance books of 2024, and it did not disappoint. I loved how Sophie and Max meet in this story. I should totally put them, if I didn't, on my list of best meet cutes and romance books. Max is hired to object at Sophie's wedding because she finds out that her fiance has cheated on her again, and she can't call off the wedding herself, given that her father works for her fiance's father. So Max basically gets her out of her nuptials by objecting, and that night they end up drinking together. And Sophie notes that she could have a lot of fun objecting at weddings too. And so some time goes by, and when Max gets another wedding gig that he could use her help on, they reconnect, and sort of the rest is history. The whole business about objecting at weddings was such a fun hook to this story, and it was super cute to see them at work. Of course, the entire need for them to object only sort of solidifies their respective attitudes toward love and marriage. Neither want it or believe in it. And yet hanging out together only sort of fuels their attraction and maybe makes them think otherwise. And turns out that they use their work together to their advantage, pretending to be more than just friends for her boss's sake, as she wants a promotion and needs to demonstrate better work-life balance, and for his parents' sake, as his dad won't retire, and then he and his dad and his mom won't move to Florida until they think he's settled. And then, so throw in some fake dating and some hot chemistry and this shared belief about love never being enough, and you've got two people who are just really fun and easy to root for. Plus, this was a really fun part, throw in some geriatric roommates for some comic relief and a much needed heart-to-heart that happens in the novel, which made this just really enjoyable, and another one that I highly recommend. Now, this month, I also read an advanced reader copy of Alison Cochran's newest romance, which releases tomorrow, April 2nd, I believe. It is her second lesbian romance called Here We Go Again, but which it is a lesbian romance, but it's also kind of more of the former friends to they became enemies to now lovers romance. This book stars Logan and Rosemary, who, again, used to be best friends when they were tweens until one party where they kissed, and then their friendship kind of imploded, and they hadn't spoken for 10 years at least, or maybe it had to have been more years, honestly, despite them now both living again back in their hometown and working at the same high school as teachers. The two of them both love, though, and have befriended a former English teacher and mentor, Joe, who has been struggling with cancer over the last 4 years, and who is now told that he only has a short time left to live. And so he asked the girls to drive him from Washington State all the way over to Bar Harbor, Maine, so that he can die while looking out at the ocean from the cabin where he used to live. So you have both women who are complete opposites in a way. Logan has ADHD and impulsivity control issues, whose life choices pretty much she just self-describes her as a fuckboy. And then there's Rosemary, whose anxiety sort of manifests as the need for complete control and planning and the need to be perfect. So putting these two together in a van with a dying man and a dog is like a recipe for disaster. And it honestly is in so many ways, but it's also this amazing journey for all of them, truly, as they travel cross country. I did enjoy the romance development between Logan and Rosemary and how they came to finally talk about what happened between them as kids and how they came to be honest with one another about their current struggles. There's a lot going on with these women that impacts their ability to trust others and feel like they are worthy of a relationship. So that's like Logan and Rosemary, right? But then there's Joe, who I was equally, if not more, captivated by. Not only him as a character, but his journey and his backstory. Don't get me wrong, this book was heart-wrenching. I mean, I was bawling my eyes out at several times, and has trigger warnings for a reason because it is about someone's death, his end of life journey, and how these two women give their favorite teacher, their sort of stand-in parent and friend, the send off that he wants, and how they sort of grieve along the way. There is also, I should say, a trigger warning about parental neglect, which, gosh, now that I think about it, is really a hot topic lately for romance books. I think I'm going to have to put together another book list about that because I think this is the third romance I've read this year that uses that theme for a particular character. But I digress. Back to Here We Go Again. So I adored Cochrane's debut novel, The Charm Offensive, and I felt like Here We Go Again brings the same level of her storytelling with what I'm gathering is her sort of need or MO to look at mental health and real life topics that impact personal lives and their relationships in her stories. It's not a particular steamy romance. There is really only one short scene that has them watching each other. So if you're not one to like steamy romances, this is not one of them. And it honestly didn't need to be, in my opinion. I love that knowing that Cochrane was a former English teacher, so I imagine she brought some of her own experience to this novel. But either way, it's definitely one of her best and just proves that she's going to be or will continue to be a must-read author for me. The final book that I read this month was 9-Month Contract by Amy Dawes. It had been over a year, or actually more than a year, since Amy's last release, Last on the List. So I was beyond excited to finally read something new from her because she is truly one of my favorite romance authors. She just has this amazing way of writing hilarious rom-coms while also kind of hitting you with all the feels and delivering the best banter. And she does it again with 9-Month Contract, which was really fabulous. This is a wannabe single dad romance with some age gap and forced proximity thrown in because Wyatt Fletcher is this mountain man who's ready to become a single dad. So he is on the hunt for someone to be a surrogate for him. But throw in 2 crazy ass brothers and a super sweet niece who wants to help him find a surrogate and love, and you get a want ad placed in the local bar and an ad up on Craigslist looking for a woman with a uterus who wants to give the mountain man a baby. It's hilarious in its setup, which leads him to interviewing Trista for the role, and he finds her perfect. And she's even willing to go the traditional surrogacy route in exchange for the money she desperately needs to start up an animal rescue that she's always wanted to do. And she's also given an apartment located above Wyatt's barn. So I have to say, from their first insemination try and attempt to their simmering attraction, and then just how all the animals on the farm just keep multiplying. This book was just such a fun read and a really great blend of Amy's humor and banter with other important topics such as body image and family love and support, and the ability to trust that someone can be there for you no matter what. Actually, this is, another book with that parental neglect theme that I had said earlier. This book kicks off a new series for Dawes, yay, and I'm already excited for the next brother's story. She set it up perfectly, and I think it's going to be hilarious. But this book, and because it's the start of a new series, can easily be read as a standalone, but you do get Wyatt's third brother, Max's story, you get Max again in this book, along with his wife and daughter, whose story you get in her latest release, Last on the List, which is definitely worth a read if you want to grab that first as well. I'm not going to go into the story more than to say that it's wonderful, one of the best of the year, and one I highly recommend you read. And I'm not going to go into it more because you'll want to tune into my podcast next week, because I had the opportunity to chat with Amy about the book, her writing, and all the things. And I'll be sharing that interview in my next podcast episode. It was seriously just so much fun and such a joy to talk with her. And I think you're really going to love that episode as we cover a lot of things, including this book. So there you have it. Quite a mix of reading month for me, with some definite misses, but also many hits as well that I highly recommend you add to your TBR list. Some really great variety too, right? From historical to paranormal to queer to rom-coms. Definitely, I think, something for everyone on this list of recommendations. So thank you so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast or my newsletter, because as I said, I'm putting the finishing touches on the She Reads Romance Books book club membership, which is going live by the end of the month. And I'm beyond excited for it. I already have several authors lined up for Q&As after reading their books, which is just going to be one benefit of membership. So get ready to join the club. But in the meantime, happy reading, because life is better with a love story. That's all for this episode of the She Reads Romance Books podcast. I hope you enjoyed it and found some new books to add to your TBR list. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast app. It really helps me reach more romance book lovers like you, and I appreciate your support. If you're a book boyfriend collector like me, then you'll want to join my email list so you never miss a podcast episode or a new book list. Just visit shereadsromancebooks.com/join and sign up today. As a thank you, I'll instantly send you my list of top 10 book boyfriends that will make you swoon. Trust me, you don't want to miss this list. Thank you for listening, and until next time, happy reading.